David Kingston, the new police chief, was brought to his knees by his own officers when they stormed into his home, destroying everything he stood to protect. The department he aimed to reform showed its true colors. The public, now aware of the truth, demanded justice. Kingston's next move shocked everyone. David Kingston, a tall black man with a confident gaze and solid posture, sat in his cozy home, enjoying a well-deserved rest after a long day at work. The living room, modestly but tastefully decorated, was quiet. A half-finished glass of red wine sat on the table next to him, and soft jazz played, creating an atmosphere of peace. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a loud knock on the door, followed by a forceful bang. David jumped, his heart racing, pumping blood through his veins. Tension filled the room as he quickly rose from his chair. "Open up, police!" A harsh, assertive voice echoed from behind the door, filled with cold confidence. David walked slowly to the door, his mind racing. He barely grabbed the doorknob when the door burst open, slamming against the wall, and a group of officers stormed in. They were in uniform, faces serious, tightly gripping their weapons. Without a moment's hesitation, they began searching the house, ignoring the stunned homeowner. "What's going on?" "I'm David Kingston, chief of police," he shouted, trying to get their attention. But his words seemed to hit an invisible barrier. The officers continued searching room after room, turning everything upside down. Shadows moved past him, pulling items from closets, flipping through personal documents, and rifling through drawers. David felt a wave of anger and helplessness rising within him, but his outraged voice remained unheard. "I demand an explanation," he yelled, but the nearest officer shot him a cold glance and walked away without answering, leaving chaos in his wake. Rage mingled with humiliation, and David felt his calm and confidence crumble. All he could do was watch as his personal life, carefully built and guarded, was torn apart before his eyes. When the officers finished the search, leaving the house in complete disarray, they returned to David, their faces showing a mix of irritation and disappointment. Having found nothing, they seemed ready to leave, but David firmly stood in their way, blocking the exit. His gaze burned with indignation, and his fists clenched tightly. He felt anger boiling up, but desperately tried to keep his composure. "What was that?" His voice trembled, not with fear, but with barely contained fury. "Why did you break into my home without a warrant?" he demanded, his eyes piercing and authoritative. Lieutenant Myers, a tall middle-aged man with a hard face and a mocking gaze, stepped forward, separating himself from the group. He smirked arrogantly, and showing not a hint of respect, said, "We received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity in this house. We were obliged to check it out." David took a deep breath, trying to restrain his mounting rage. "Suspicious activity?" he repeated coldly, his muscles tense like a drawn bow. Slowly, with deliberate restraint, he pulled his badge out of his pocket and held it up right in front of Myers' face, where a flicker of surprise appeared. "Take a closer look, Lieutenant," he said, emphasizing each word, his voice low and steady. The badge, gleaming gold against its leather case, clearly read, "David Kingston, Chief of Police." Myers' face turned pale, his mocking expression replaced by shock and confusion. He looked as if his world had just collapsed before his eyes. Myers stepped back slowly, stammering, This was a mistake." His voice now shaky, fear flickering in his eyes. The other officers, previously confident in their actions, stood frozen, stunned by the truth that had been revealed. One officer, his hand still on his holster, averted his gaze nervously. Another hung his head, unable to meet David's eyes. A heavy, unbearable silence filled the room. Everyone present understood the gravity of the mistake they had made by targeting their own chief, a man holding the highest authority in the department. And David, still holding his badge, felt a bitter satisfaction that the truth was finally on his side, but it was mixed with a sense of humiliation and anger at the unjust treatment he had endured. The incident spread like wildfire. Shortly after the raid, as the officers left David's home, neighbors who had been watching with anxiety and disbelief began posting photos and videos on social media. Videos, captured from various angles on smartphones, documented the entire ordeal. The police's forceful entry, the search of the rooms, and David's final confrontation when he showed his badge, forcing them to retreat. The posts quickly gained thousands of views and comments, igniting a wave of discussions. Local media rapidly picked up the story, and within hours, every TV channel and news website was reporting on the police department scandal. Headlines screamed, "Unjust raid! Police official victimized by police error. Systemic racism in action." Journalists scrambled to get an interview with David, but he chose to wait for an official statement. Realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, David gathered his strength and made an official address. He stated that incidents like this should not be silenced, that every violation of citizens' rights must be thoroughly and transparently investigated. David demanded an internal investigation and publicly promised that all those involved in misconduct would be held accountable. Lieutenant Myers and all officers involved in the raid were temporarily suspended pending investigation. Public reaction was intense. The incident sparked an unprecedented response. Social media posts with hashtags supporting David and demanding justice spread rapidly. People from various backgrounds, races, and ages began actively discussing the issue of systemic racism in policing. Demonstrations erupted in the streets, with participants holding banners calling for reforms and supporting David Kingston. Special attention was drawn to slogans emphasizing the need for change and equality within law enforcement. Television talk shows and radio programs invited experts, activists, and public figures to discuss bias in law enforcement. This case became a catalyst for a broad conversation about systemic racism, the need for reforms, and mandatory bias training for police officers. Many supported David, seeing in his response an example of determination and integrity. Others demanded his resignation, believing that a police chief should have better control over his subordinates. No one remained indifferent. Even those previously distant from such issues were now closely following developments, realizing that this incident was just the tip of the iceberg of systemic problems demanding immediate resolution. Weeks of tension passed. David Kingston actively participated in the investigation, meeting daily with internal auditors, lawyers, and community representatives. He wanted to ensure that every step of the investigation would be as honest and transparent as possible. Documents and testimonies gathered during this process not only highlighted errors made during the raid, but also exposed deep-seated issues within the department related to bias and abuse of power. As the investigation concluded, David held a press conference in the City Hall's large auditorium. The room was filled with tense anticipation. Local media, activists, and ordinary citizens occupied every corner. At the front, under bright spotlights, stood David. He looked calm and confident, aware of the tremendous responsibility on his shoulders. "Today, I stand before you to announce the results of the internal investigation we conducted over the past few weeks," he began, his voice firm and resolute. He briefly outlined the discovered violations, emphasizing that the actions of the officers involved in the raid were not only improper, but also revealed deep distrust and bias towards specific population groups. Then, after a brief pause, David moved on to the most important part. "We cannot ignore these problems. We cannot allow this to happen again. Therefore, I am announcing a series of comprehensive reforms that will impact every level of our police department." He outlined a reform plan, including mandatory bias training for all officers, the creation of an independent commission to handle complaints about police misconduct, and measures to increase transparency and accountability for every officer. Lieutenant Myers and all officers involved in the raid were dishonorably discharged. David explained that the firings were not acts of revenge, but fair consequences for violating professional ethics and abusing power. He also emphasized that every individual deserves fair and respectful treatment, regardless of their race, social status, or position. His words were met with thunderous applause from the audience. Many in the room, including activists who had previously been skeptical, now supported him. David also announced the establishment of special public forums, where city residents could discuss police issues and suggest ideas for improving law enforcement work. The community rallied behind David. His determination and willingness to implement change became symbols of justice and honesty. People started to view him not just as a police chief, but as a leader willing to fight for the rights and interests of all citizens, regardless of their background. Graffiti with his image and slogans supporting reforms appeared on city walls. In the following months, the police department underwent significant changes. A new, more open approach to work, active engagement with the community, and the introduction of training programs helped transform the department's internal culture. Officers who once believed their actions would go unpunished now understood that every step would be scrutinized, not just by their superiors, but by the community as well. David Kingston solidified his reputation as a strong and fair leader, capable of acknowledging mistakes and learning from them. His decisive actions demonstrated that justice could prevail, even when circumstances seemed grim. He proved that change is possible if one acts honestly, and with the conviction that every person deserves equality before the law.